All right. So thank you for joining us today, Christa in the house. Welcome to the Joie de Vivre podcast. It's a pleasure having you here.
It's a
I'm very
pleasure to be here.
excited. Thank you so much. So, if we can start by telling us about your journey and what led you to what you are doing today.
Yes, so I am a pediatric speech therapist and I specialize in feeding. And what led me to specialize in feeding was my own feeding journey with my two children who both had feeding difficulties as infants. And so I wanted to figure out why. I wanted to figure out what was going on. And as a speech therapist, one of the things you can do is feeding. And so that led me to my specialty.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And just for everybody, Krista and I connected on the feeding and speech space because I had a similar experience with my son, and I'm so grateful. I came across her, information, and we connected. And she's been a tremendous help. And I had such an amazing experience with you. I always tell myself, there is no way I'm not going to tell parents out there that you are great and you have some amazing information to share, because what you shared with me not only made my life easier, but give me a better approach about dealing with certain situations that I was panicking about or not knowing what to do. So thank you so much for being here today. It's a great pleasure. So we're going to focus today on tongue ties and lip ties, because as we discussed before the interview, they're crucial for so many reasons, not just speaking or pronouncing words and sentences, but also in terms of feeding, sleeping, and especially breathing. That's very important for little kids and also for adults. I mean, if we don't get those 7 hours or 5 to 7, we won't be functioning properly during the day. So if we imagine how it's going to be for children, it's a huge deal. So if you can just tell us a little bit, what is tongue ties or lip or tongue tie, and like how it's becoming very common nowadays, how many, I mean, not necessarily numbers, but just give us an idea in general.
Yeah, so a tongue tie is a band of tissue that connects your tongue to the floor of your mouth. And it's a problem whenever it restricts the range of motion. And the same thing for a lip tie. A lip tie is a band of tissue that connects your gums to your upper lip. And again, it becomes a problem when it restricts the range of motion.
Okay. And just so everybody can know, so basically the tongue tie is whatever it's under here, and the lip tie is right here. And I never thought about it actually before I've been in this situation. So it's very important. So there were a few cases. I read some articles that mentioned some parents were like, well, if the kid fall, maybe they will lose it, or like maybe when they get older, the thing will stretch, itself naturally. There were concerns about doing procedures, especially in the past before the laser was introduced. And so, and there were also some adults who didn't know they had tongue ties until like years later because of some headaches or like tension, in the neck area, or like breathing issues. And then they're here with like, oh, you have a tongue tie and you've been living with it for like 25 years or so. So does it really resolve on its own? Is it, or it's a myth?
No, that is a myth. It will always be there. I don't like the argument that leave it alone and your toddler will rip it when they fall, because we would never say that about something else. If there's something that's impeding the function, we want to take care of it. But it will always be there and it won't stretch. Whatever your range of motion is going to be your range of motion. And when I talk about the range of motion, I look at several different. Some is elevation, that's lifting your tongue up, lifting your tongue side to side, sticking your tongue out. That is never going to change with age. Whatever your range of motion is what it is.
Okay. That makes sense. And so the tongue is a muscle, right? So if it's sitting there and it's restricted, then it creates so many problems. It impacts the airways. That's something you and I spoke a lot about. So what are some of the complications or the symptoms that kids experience during this tongue tie period if it's not treated?
Yeah, so if it's not treated, every child is different, but it can impact early on. It can impact breastfeeding. It can impact bottle feeding. It can impact transitioning to solid foods, and it can also impact speech. And as you said, that tongue is a muscle. And so if you're not using that tongue properly from infancy, then it actually never builds the strength that it needs to have.
Okay. And so when it comes to like feeding, for example, or breathing, like, is it because the tongue is not able to move and like clear the jaw area and like clear that space for the airways, or it's just because it's like restricted?
Yeah. So for the for breathing and for sleeping, so for eating, it's a little bit different on how that restriction impacts. For breathing and for sleeping, it's that what happens is when we lay on our back, if our tongue is restricted, it's actually going to fall back into your airway. And then it's what we call obstructive sleep apnea, because it's literally obstructing your airway. And that can start from infancy. So if you find that you have a child who prefers to sleep on their tummy, it may be because it's bringing their tongue forward out of their airway.
Wow. Okay. And how about the feeding part? How does it work?
Yeah, so for the feeding part, so for breastfeeding and bottle feeding, if you're not able to elevate the back of your tongue to create a proper suck pattern, then you're inefficient, typically, at removing milk from the breast or the bottle. And so that's when we encounter long feeding times or a clicking sound, or just general inefficiency with bottle feeding or breastfeeding. For solid foods, what happens is if they're not able to move their tongue from side to side, then they're not able to move the food to where it needs to be to chew. And so then we can get gagging, we can get bad experiences with not being able to manage food and chew food properly.
And that can also impact the digestive system as well, correct?
If you don't chew your food, it all starts in your mouth. So if you don't chew it properly, and if you don't chew it enough, then it definitely impacts digestion.
And the swallowing as well, right?
Yes, actually, there's been case studies of children where it will go the wrong way, so to speak. That's called aspiration. And then they have a tongue tie release, and then they repeat the assessment for the swallow, and then it is going the right way, because it really does all start with your tongue.
So it is serious.
Yeah, it can impact so many different things.
Yeah. And so in terms of like behaviors, like whether it's kids or adults, if we're not sleeping properly or we're not eating properly, then we might have like, sleep apnea or like, indigestion issues and so on, that can lead to so many things. That means this kind of like issue can also impact our day-to-day life, correct?
Absolutely.
Can you give us a little bit idea about it?
Yeah, we can see it in our younger kids. Sometimes it presents like ADHD, but it's actually not that. It's actually that they're not getting quality sleep. And we think they're behavior problems, but it actually all stems from not getting enough oxygen while they're sleeping. And then it manifests it during the day.
Or they're getting oxygen, but it's not the proper quality that the brain.
It's not the proper quality. It's not enough.
Because that process is not moving like and kids by nature, they want to fight the sleep, or if they're not feeling okay, and so they go on like action mode.
Yeah, it's true. It makes everything, they get put almost in that fight or flight, and everything is heightened. Because what happens is whenever we were talking about the quality of the oxygen, so you're supposed to breathe through your nose, but with a tongue tie, you often end up breathing through your mouth, because your mouth is resting, or your tongue is resting low in your mouth. Your tongue is actually supposed to rest up against your
right here
palate. Yep. Most people don't know that. They think it's supposed to rest low.
That's the bed. I call it the bed of the tongue.
It is. That's right. So, but then you get the better quality oxygen is if you're breathing through your nose.
Okay, that's great. So, and you can see it easily with children, right? Because we call them mouth breathers. So most of the time they sleep with their mouth open.
They sleep with their mouth open. If they're watching TV, their mouth is open. I can tell a lot when I go to meet somebody for the first time just by how their mouth is at rest.
Okay, so let's get to the very important part right now, is that we think, or we see some, symptoms that tell us that the child is having, a myofunctional issue. And so what's next step? Like, do we consult with a specialist in the area to do a consultation and check it out? Because some of them, they're posterior, anterior? How do we
Mhm.
know what type, and like how to go about doing it pretty much?
Yes, so there are pediatric ENTs, that's ears, nose, and throat. And then there's also pediatric dentists. These specialists also exist for adults.
Mhm.
And but you have to go to somebody who is knowledgeable about ties, who specializes in them, because not everybody specializes in them. And you want somebody who's going to be able to identify it. That's the first point. But then you're going to want somebody who can properly release it, because what we're going to want is for that band of tissue, if it's restricting the motion of the tongue, we're going to want them to release that band.
Okay.
And to do so, there needs to be what we call a complete release, where, like you said, there's usually a posterior component. Sometimes you can see it and it's very evident. There's an
Yeah.
anterior component.
Right on the
In the very front.
yeah.
But even if there's an anterior, then there's probably a posterior as well. So you want
Right
somebody who's
underneath.
who can release all of it
Okay.
and not just the front portion.
Okay, and same for the lip tie. Some of the lip ties go all the way to the front teeth, right?
They can go all the way down to the gum line, and they can actually create a gap between the two front teeth if it wraps around.
Or as you remember the case for my son where his bottom teeth were pushed inward.
Yep, they were, it was actually, his tie was actually pulling them
Inside, yeah. So it
Mhm.
can cause all kind of like dental issues, right?
Yes, it definitely, that's one of the other things that it causes is dental issues. If you can't move your tongue to the side, you actually can't clear food from there. So cavities are pretty prevalent.
Yes.
Mouth breathing also, right? You're going to get all those germs. But then if it's a lip tie, food can actually get stuck up here and cause decay of your front two teeth.
How about the palate structure? Like that, is it also impacted?
It is, because if your tongue sits low in your mouth, it's not actually providing the input to your palate that it needs. So what ends up happening is our palates are becoming high and narrow, and they're supposed to be broad and with a low arch. And so that actually impacts breathing as well, because then our nasal cavities are actually much smaller than what they should be, because the palate is now up into the nasal cavity.
Higher, and that impact the jaw as well. Like
it's going to impact your teeth, because your face is going to be more narrow. And so that's why we get overcrowding, because our jaws actually aren't growing to the width that they need to be.
And you can imagine this is just for a kid. So can you imagine if you keep that for like 20 years or 30 years?
Yeah. Well, and that's why, a lot of times if people get braces and they don't do anything about the palate, their teeth are, if they don't wear their retainer, their teeth are going to shift exactly back to where they are, because there's no extra space. Their jaw never grew.
That's interesting. And so the good news is that once you get to the level of like, okay, we're gonna take care of it, the earlier the better, then you can consult with a doctor and get the appointment scheduled, and then there is a preparation before the surgery and after the surgery, which is
there is
right.
And like you mentioned, that tongue is a muscle, and so if you haven't been using it, it's not as strong as it needs to be. And so we have to do what you mentioned earlier, myofunctional therapy. That's therapy to help us prepare for those releases, but then therapy to also get optimal function after the releases. So if you just do a release, not much is going to change. You have to start building the muscles, the jaw muscles, right? We need to make those stronger. And then we also need to work on getting that tongue to move. We may not see a lot of movement before the releases, but we're teaching that motor memory, that muscle memory of this is what you're supposed to do. And then after the releases, we continue working on it so that we keep building strength. And then we keep, now that we have that range of motion, teaching that tongue to move how it's supposed to move.
Yeah, and something that I learned through my experience is that your brain thinks that your tongue is tied. And so even post procedure, you see, the brain still thinks the same thing. So it takes a lot of work and the tongue discipline and therapy to kind of send those new signals to the brain, like, okay, I'm free, I can do things now, because because humans by nature, we learn how to compensate, right?
Yes.
And so kids develop tools to do things that they're supposed to do with their tongue. And they just get used to it and becomes the norm for them. So it takes a while to transition.
And that becomes their habit, right? And habits are hard to break. So we have to teach new habits.
So it takes a while. And so how long we have to do therapy before and after the surgery?
So it depends on before, because just every child is different and every adult is different. But if if it's a case where they're not orally averse, that means that they're happy to work on the chewy tubes or or work on the work with some vibration. If they're happy to do those things, then sometimes we can do 3 weeks of therapy in preparation before, and then we have the releases. If a child is orally defensive, that means they don't want you anywhere near their face, then we have to work on building that trust first and desensitizing that. And then we work on the preparatory phase. The after is can be a little bit longer. And that is because even though now they have that range of motion, like you said, learning how to use that and trusting, I find that often children, they're sore after. And so they don't really want to try out and see how it can move. And it's not until after they're fully healed that then they're willing to try some of the things that we're asking them to do.
Yeah. And also breaking those the old habits.
And the older you are, the harder it is.
Yes. So that's why the earlier the better, because with newborns it's much easier.
With newborns it's much easier. They have way less preparatory. We do some suck training, they get the release. We do some more suck training and they're done.
And you don't need to work on the mindset and all of that, and convincing if the child has strong will or not.
Oh yeah, strong wills.
Yeah, tell me about it, right?
we always have to find something that motivates them.
They want to be their own boss and everything, so that doesn't help. But nowadays we still should be thankful, because there's so many things out there, the things that you recommended, the chewies, those vibrating brushes.
Yep.
There's so many things with music. I mean, you will find some tools to kind of like make that process fun, because kids function when things are fun. They don't like boring adult things.
Yes, the key is to make it fun.
Yeah. And then the rest will happen, slowly and gradually. So to close this amazing conversation, I've been reading articles about adults who found out they had a tongue tie when they were born. Years down the road, there was like a dentist who had severe migraines, and then he went to another doctor for a checkup, and he told him, you have a tongue tie, and he was like in disbelief because he's a dentist himself. And so his was super hidden. Its posterior is all the way deep there, and it's restricting the whole system and causing him severe pain on the back of his head. And so he decided to take a certification on tongue ties, and actually he started promoting the releases and things like that. So what's an advice you can give adults, since we were focused mostly on kids during the call?
Yeah, well, I think you touched on it, is that if left untreated, they can have symptoms in adulthood, and recognizing what those are. Migraines can be one, neck tension can be one, jaw pain, TMJ, can be one, poor oral hygiene, right? If you have a lot of cavities, that can be an indication. You could have speech issues. You can have digestion issues. You can have sleep apnea. So these are all things, if you're experiencing any of these symptoms, to investigate further. As an adult, you do need to have myofunctional therapy, which requires an evaluation by a myofunctional therapist prior to a release, and then have the release, and then continue myofunctional therapy for the most positive outcome.
And same like with the children, you can do the release and you can follow up with therapies, and it's easier because you're in control. You don't need to do it for someone else. So that's great. That's amazing. Yeah.
Exactly. It just usually takes longer as an adult than it does as a child.
Well, what's a final message you can share with the audience today for parents who have kids with either a diagnosed tongue tie or an undiagnosed tongue tie, and they're thinking about it or they're not sure about it?
Yeah, that there are resources out there that are available to you. Use them to find out more about it, and really having a functional assessment to see how it impacts your child. Because some children it will impact them minimally, some children it will impact them severely. And so really finding out how it is specific to your child, and then what you can do to help them.
And there's always people to guide you throughout the process. Just raise
Always.
your hands. Sounds great. Thank you so much for your time, Christa. It's a pleasure having you here today. This is an amazing conversation that will spread awareness about this tongue tie issue that's not always, getting enough attention on the media. So I'm so happy to have you here. And thank you so much again for joining Joie de Vivre podcast.
Thanks for having me.